May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Some words from the letter of Paul to the Galatians, chapter 6 and verse 9. Let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time. Let us not grow weary in doing what is right. The story is told of a congregation of about 250 members, but there were 5 constantly negative parishioners. And one day these 5 parishioners went to the priest and said to him, "There's a need to get rid of the choir director." I'm not talking about Mr. Ralph. Right? We cannot stand his singing and the songs and the hymns he chooses for the choir. And so the priest, controlled by these 5 negative people, went to the organist and the choir director and said to him, "There are about 6 people in the congregation who thinks it's time for you to leave." And he looked at the priest and said, "Well, that's funny. I know about 200 people in the congregation who don't like your preaching. Maybe it's time for you to leave." All of us grow weary and tired. All of us get exhausted at times. Isn't that so? Parents sometimes get tired of their children nagging them. Children grow weary of their parents often correcting them. Husbands and wives, thankfully none in this congregation, sometimes get tired of each other and need their space. Bosses get tired of lazy employees, and employees get tired of over-demanding bosses. There are times when we as individuals get tired of people taking advantage of us, of our kindness, of our generosity. We grow weary and thin of it. And the same is true in the spiritual, dear friends. There are times when even we as Christians get tired of ministry. It feels as though there are only a few of us doing all of the work. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Times when we get tired of doing what is right, praying for others. Times when we get tired of being the one who always has to expend love and forgiveness. And we question ourselves at times, "Lord, why must I always be the one to make the effort? Be the one to forgive, the one to do the right thing?" Being a Christian can sometimes take its toll on you. Yes, it does. And this action of becoming weary, of life taking its toll on us, is what the secular world calls burnout. The psychotherapist may say you are overwhelmed. The spiritual director may say that you are spiritually bereft. Burnout, you know what that is? It is emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion in the midst of stress and distress. Are you burnt out? Are you exhausted? There are signs that let us know when we are, dear friends. You know, the constant feeling of wanting to give up, the lack of motivation, easily being irritated constantly, mood changes left, right, and center. Some of you may say that's normal, but no, it's not. These are signs that we are feeling burnt out, where we withdraw from relationships, we isolate ourselves, and we have a lowered immunity to illness. Burnout is a very common experience, and it can be in spurts or it can be prolonged. And it can happen when we don't take care of ourselves. The writers from the Bible realize that from time to time it's hard to work for God. It's difficult doing the right thing. And so they offer words of encouragement. It was Isaiah who said, "Those who wait on the Lord, he shall renew their strength. He shall mount them up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Paul says, the letter to the Hebrews, run this race with perseverance, with our eyes fixed on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And St. Paul said, do not lose heart. And today, he says, let's not grow weary in doing what is right. The Galatian church was growing weary of false teachers in their midst, tired of all the demands of what this new Christian life had called them to do. So Paul urged them to continue doing right, to continue to be that new creation to which God had called them. For ultimately, they will be rewarded. Dear friends, when we as Christians grow weary, there are a number of things we can do. We can seek spiritual direction. We can go on a spiritual retreat. We can take sabbaticals. We can pray. We can ask God for understanding. We can set boundaries. We don't always have to say yes to everything in the church. We can withdraw from times, not thinking that we have to do it all by ourselves. These are practical measures that we can take. But I believe Paul offers us some insight that can help with our mental and our emotional toughness in the midst of weariness. 3 things he shares with us. How can you and I keep ourselves from growing weary when we are always trying to do the right thing? Well, the first, he says, is to keep our eyes on the eternal. Keep our eyes, yes, on the life hereafter, but on the eternal, the idea that God is always in control, that ultimately this is God's world. He says, let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap at harvest time. The harvest time refers to the eternal. Paul was suggesting that the time would eventually come when our faithfulness to God and our doing good will be rewarded. But with that said, the reality is it is still hard to do good because not everyone will appreciate your goodness. So you pick up your children's socks and clothing 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and eventually you get tired, right? You cook every day and they don't like this, they don't want this, could you fix something else? And so you're constantly changing. We grow tired of doing what is right. You're the only one always doing it, and people don't always appreciate it. That's hard to maintain your goodness and generosity in the face of it. But as Jesus proclaimed in the gospel today, even as a Christian, when you do good, not everyone will receive it. And there was a times you really need to shake the dust off your feet and move on. Let it go. Don't hold on to that. But in the event that you find yourself growing weary, believe in the system and the process of good. That was the example of Jesus. That was the example of Job, by keeping their eyes on the eternal. Remember the story of Job, don't you? Job was a faithful servant of God. And one day, he started experiencing challenge after challenge. He lost his children, he lost his riches. It got to a point where Job was so sick that his wife said to him, curse God and die. Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That was the example of Jesus. Even though he had done good for so many people, brought healing to their lives, helped them, they still turned around and nailed him to the cross. They spat upon him. Yes, they mocked him. But what happened to Job? What happened to Jesus? We are told that Job's fortune was restored fourfold because he kept on doing what is good. He remained faithful to God. And what was meant as a travesty for Jesus really became his majesty. The point is this, dear friends. When we keep our eyes on the eternal, our weariness becomes liveliness. Keep your eyes on God's eternal purposes. Focus on the example of Jesus, who continued to do good for the joy that was set before him. I can guarantee you, if you keep your eyes on the eternal, you can endure your weariness. But like Peter, if we take our eyes off of the eternal, off of Jesus, while walking on water, we can sink. So the first point is this: keep your eyes on the eternal. And the second point he makes is when we're growing weary is that remember that what we sow is what we shall reap. If you do good, good will come to you. Eventually, not to make the world sound very mechanical, but that's the principle of the Bible, that what we sow is what we shall reap. Paul reminded the Galatians that in due season we shall reap the good that we have sown. The book of Ecclesiastes warns us that there is a season for everything under the heavens and under the earth. The time will come when the consequences of our actions, whether good or bad, will come to pass. I was sharing with the congregation this morning 2 brief stories. And one is about sowing good and reaping that which is good. The other is about sowing negativity and reaping that which is negative. And I'll share one experience I had in the bank as a 18-year-old young man, out of school, going to college, working in the bank, making money. About 3 months into it, still learning, there was a gentleman who came into the bank and who was very loud and boisterous about his money and demanding that he be served quickly. The line was too long, etc. And why did they give him this new teller who doesn't know what he's doing, etc. And so from the person who was training me, I simply took the money and gave it to him without counting it. What happened was I ended up giving him $500 more than he was supposed to get. At the end of the day, I knew exactly what had happened because I knew that I was going to balance. And when I realized I was $499.95 short, that moment came to me immediately. I went to the man and I said to him, etc., because his business was right around the corner where he worked. And he refuted everything in some very choice words. The manager called him and said, look, we know this is what happened, etc. And he insisted, and the people at his work said, well, there's nothing we can do. And I said, fine. Well, you don't get necessarily fired for these things. You get a warning, right? And you don't necessarily have to pay it back. You pay 10% of it out of your salary. And so that's what I did. And I said nothing. I said, Lord, it's a learning experience. I'm done. 2 months later, this same man was fired from his company because he was stealing from them as well. What we sow is what we eventually reap. And everything we do somehow catches up to us. We have to be careful. And that's the principle Paul is saying. If we sow good, it will eventually come to us. I believe that I am reaping a lot of goodness from my forefathers, from my foremothers, my mother and grandmother and all those who've done good throughout the years. And you know, my mom always used to say, whatever you do, just do good. And whenever I went to school, she would say, don't ever let a teacher or an administrator call me, whether you're in the wrong or not, because you should not have put yourself in that position for them to call me. And I said, one day, I decided to be disobedient, and I snuck a basketball out of the home and took it with me to school. I was scot-free until the last class at the end of the day, when my friend decided to take the basketball out of my bag and started to bounce it in the classroom. And to the annoyance of the teacher, he said, who is bouncing that basketball? Bring it to me now. And everything upon me dropped because I knew that that was the end of the basketball. And my mom would ask, where is the basketball at some point? Well, I went to the teacher and I said, Mr. Ross, could you give us the basketball, blah, blah, blah. My friend should not have been playing with it. Now, this is a top class, and we were very, very cool with the teacher, and he was often laid back. And he said, no, y'all should not have been bouncing this ball in the class. I am tired of you students taking advantage of me. And I said, Mr. Ross, now, be better than that. He said, be better than that? Who are you talking to, young man? Straight to the office. So, to the office I go. And one thing you need to know about me is that I was the perfect child. never got into problems, right? And so when I went to the office, to the surprise of the vice principal, he said, Mario? I said, yeah, I know. Me in the office? Could you believe that? And he said, what happened? And I explained to him. He said, well, an example must be set. Now, two things. I can either give you licks, because that's what they did in those days, or I can call your mother. I said, Mr. Roll, for my own good, you better give me licks. Don't call my mother up to this school. But that was the kind of thing she sowed into us, that you must do good, you must be obedient, because when you're not, eventually you feel the consequences of your actions. I was disobedient. I took the ball without her knowing and tried to sneak it out. Eventually, my sins, my disobedience caught up with me. What am I saying? Every action has a reaction. And sometimes you may wonder, why is my spouse so miserable? You may wonder, why is my child reacting the way they do? And before we begin pointing fingers, I often say to individuals, ask yourselves, what kind of presence do I have when I'm with this person? Is there something I'm doing that's possibly causing them to react? Well, my husband, he never wants to talk through issues. Do you give him a chance to talk when you are having those disagreements? My child thinks he's entitled, thinks she's entitled. How are you enabling that? Think about these things, because often we reap what we sow. Do not grow weary then in doing what is right. If you keep in mind that principle, says Paul, know that it will eventually pay off. And finally, in our weary moments, if we keep focused on the eternal, if we remember that what we sow is what we shall reap, and then the third point is to remember that God will not be mocked, we can overcome weariness. Remember, God will not be mocked, says Paul. He will have the final say. We can fool ourselves, but we cannot fool God. We can, dear friends, deceive ourselves, but we cannot deceive God. A friend of mine often used to say, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but someday God will have his say. And what he says will ultimately prevail. So often we live as if we control our lives. We sometimes forget that we have a maker and a creator, that we have a God above. The God of love and mercy will not, dear friends, turn a blind eye to the evils of this world. I firmly believe that. Yes, evil will not and cannot last forever. That's what God says, and that's what we should believe. As you celebrate independence here in America, a lot of unfortunate things happen. A lot of things have happened that can turn you into a very negative, pessimistic, and bitter person. But don't allow the happenings and the circumstances of the world and your nation to turn you into that kind of individual. Paul says, keep in mind that there is a God above who will not be mocked. And someday he will right every wrong in our society. So keep doing what is right, because the God we serve is Alpha and Omega. He's beginning and end. Feeling burnt out? Feeling weary as a Christian? Tired of doing what is right? Keep on doing what is right. Focus on the eternal. Remember, what we sow is what we shall reap. And we serve a God who will not be mocked. Amen.